Welcome to the third dimension. The US launched what analysts are describing as one of the largest bombing missions in Yemen in years. The strikes targeted Houthi leaders and terrorist infrastructure. The Trump administration promised a tougher stance against Yemen Houthi rebels, and its new airstrike campaign appears to be more intense and more extensive than those launched by the Biden administration. The strikes against the Iran-backed rebels began March the 15th and continue. Meanwhile, observers warn that the United States strikes are playing whack-a-mole, proving ineffective in addressing the Houthi threat. The Houthi war machine remains resilient in the face of these strikes, and Houthi resolve also appears strong. To discuss this topic, joins me from Washington, D.C., Dr. Michael Rubin. Dr. Rubin is a senior research scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He was previously a Pentagon official in Iran, Iraq, and Yemen. Dr. Rubin, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, if we start straight away from the current US strikes, Dr. Rubin, and my question is, how are the current strikes different from Biden's?
The biggest difference between the strikes under Trump and the strikes under Biden is that the Trump administration appears to be going after senior Houthi leaders. They're not simply trying to go after weapons emplacements and so forth, but they're going after Houthi leaders where they sleep. And it does not appear that that is controversial in the United States, nor that that policy will change. In fact, I would expect that sort of targeting to accelerate after the Houthis directly threatened Donald Trump in response to the initial strikes. That's not a tactic that Donald Trump ignores. I just want for a moment to contrast this, the behavior of the Houthis and what we see coming out of Iraq. Of course, in Iraq, there's the Hashd al-Shaabi, there's several Iranian-backed militias.
Yeah.
And while the Houthis have been accelerating their attacks throughout the region, Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani in Baghdad has managed to force the Shia militias in Iraq to stand down because they understand that Trump is not Biden. Trump is much more serious, and that they're playing with fire if they don't properly understand what the attitude and the policy-making decisions in the United States are right now.
Yeah. Now, with all respect to what you have said, Dr. Rubin, now, on the contrary, also, some experts warn that those strikes, could be what they framed as a whack-a-mole approach, and this whack-a-mole approach needs what we call a rethink upstream rather than down. How would you react?
I would say that's naive. Look, under the Biden administration, the U.S. had initially scaled back pressure on the Houthis. You remember that one of the first actions which Secretary of State Antony Blinken had taken back in January of 2021 was to lift sanctions on the Houthis. The way which I interpret these complaints, that actually the military action needs to be scaled back, it's the same sort of activation of the Houthi propaganda network that includes groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so forth.
Yeah.
It's the same it's the same pattern that we saw in the run-up to the discussion about taking the port of Hodeidah back in 2018. And we also saw by scaling back then, it actually empowered the Houthis. What I would actually suggest moving forward is that we need not only to ramp up the military strikes, but also reframe how humanitarian aid is carried out.
Yeah.
There should be absolutely no aid channeled through the port of Hodeidah.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
Stockholm Agreement was an embarrassment
Yeah.
that doesn't stop the Houthi smuggling.
Okay.
Instead, all international aid should be sent through Aden or Mukalla.
Yeah.
At the same time, the United Nations has got to stop being willing hostages to the Houthis.
Yeah.
The internationally recognized government is now in Aden, and so should the United Nations be.
Okay.
With the Houthi arresting United Nations and aid workers, there's no excuse for anyone to be based in Sana'a.
Okay. Now, perhaps we can talk about the humanitarian consequences of these strikes a little bit later. But let us stick to the strikes, Dr. Rubin. Okay. Some other observers say that airstrikes alone are not enough. In fact, they suggest that why not forming what we call a partnership with local actors, and by local actors we could mean the Yemeni government forces, okay, in which they can defeat the Houthis in the end of the day. And my question is, how far is this option, that means supporting the Yemeni government forces, is on the table of US decision makers?
To be perfectly blunt, the United States is not going to send boots onto the ground in Yemen. There's no appetite within the Trump administration for that sort of involvement. But this isn't an either-or question. There are other actions we can take. And the Yemenis, especially the Southern Transitional Council and so forth, are perfectly capable of defeating the Houthis, so long as the Houthis don't get resupply. There's three ways the Houthis get resupply. Through Sana'a International Airport, which should be shut down immediately. Through the port of Hodeidah, which should be shut down immediately with aid channeled through Aden and Mukalla. And then there is the problem of Oman, which seems to be willingly smuggling weaponry to the Houthis ahead of the Battle of Mada. If we're able to cut down all three of those resupply mechanisms, then it's possible to defeat the Houthis. What I would actually say is that the United States should station forces in Oman, in Masyuna, in order to monitor and interdict smugglers. So they would not be in Yemen, they would be in Oman. At the same time, you asked about the whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
One of the problems with the Biden administration was that it signaled to Saudi Arabia that we weren't serious about defeating the Houthis. And as a result, Saudi Arabia decided to make accommodation. They just wanted to have some sort of quiet, even if it meant the Houthis would continue to exist. By showing that the Trump administration is serious, then Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates too can do what's necessary to defeat the Houthis, knowing that the United States has their back.
Okay. Now, as you have mentioned, Oman, Dr. Rubin, it would be natural to also mention Iran in this context, as we are talking about weapon smuggling, etc. Okay, and while the Houthis do maintain capability, observers say it is largely because of the 10 years of support provided by Iran. My question is, what can be done to create a wedge between the Iranian and Houthi interests, especially when the Houthis are seen less as a proxy and more of a willing partner as their regional influence?
You know, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. When I talk about smuggling from Oman, the question is, what is Oman helping to smuggle? And that, of course, is Iranian weaponry. Now, part of Donald Trump's strategy of going after Houthi leaders is to basically cut off this Iranian-Houthi nexus. But I've been to Sada before. I've been to Sana'a before. And the Houthis aren't necessarily united. Many of those who are living under Houthi occupation, including in Sada, are actually living in terror because of the Houthi dictatorship. At the same time, I've been to Najaf and Karbala at the same time which Houthi leaders were meeting with Ayatollahs, with Marja al-Taqlid. And what they were being told is that they needed to convert from Zaydism to Ithnei Ashra Shiism. That should be an insult to every single Houthi. So is there opportunity for the Houthis to break away and become part of a future? Yes, but there can be no compromise. They need to leave Sana'a. They need to go back to Sada. The internationally recognized government should take over Yemen, and if the Houthis drop their arms, then of course they can contest local elections or be part of some future political arrangement.
Okay.
But they're not going to win this through terrorism. They should understand what happened to Hezbollah. They are next.
Okay. Now, as you are just talking about Hezbollah leaders, we are talking about in the same way how can the US also target Houthi leaders. And let me here bring something, Dr. Rubin. Yemenis usually wonder, okay, they say that United States being a superpower, okay, can reach Houthi leaders. And just the irony of fate, 2 weeks back, Muhammad Ali al-Houthi appeared in an open celebration in a Sab'in field, and he gave a speech for half an hour, and he was not targeted. How would you interpret this, Dr. Rubin?
Well, first of all, many people in the region overestimate the capabilities of intelligence. You need to know where a leader is going to be 2 or 3 hours in advance, not where they are in an instant if the weaponry involved is far away. At the same time, the United States is conscious of collateral damage. They may want to target Houthi leaders. They don't want to kill hundreds of Yemenis doing so. When the United States, under the first Trump administration, took out Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad, they took him out on a 5-kilometer stretch of highway, the airport road, along which no one lived. And so they didn't need to worry about collateral damage. That said, if the Houthis continue to target the United States may become less reticent. What I would also suggest is the United States needs to have drones in the air, over Sada, over Sana'a, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so that we don't have this gap in time. And frankly, the Saudis and the Emiratis need to do this as well, because this is a regional issue. This isn't just an American issue. And let's not forget that the Southern Transitional Council also has a role to play in defeating the Houthis. And they are more than willing to do so.
Okay. Now, as you've just raised the issue of the United States and the collateral damage, that means protecting Yemeni civilians is priority number 1 before targeting Houthi leaders. This brings me to the issue of many Yemenis nowadays, Dr. Rubin, okay, after the strikes, etc., they also fear that such strikes could endanger Yemen peace roadmap, and the United Nations Special Envoy said that bluntly in his last briefing in the Security Council. The question is, okay, and another issue also that worries Yemenis, when the Secretary of Defense, the US Secretary of Defense, commenting on the US strikes said, "We don't care what happens in Yemen's civil war. We are stopping pirates shooting at our ships." How would you react to this?
Well, first of all, when it comes to the civilian involvement and so forth, there's no excuse for wanton casualties if they can be avoided. When it comes to the United Nations roadmap, the United Nations interest is protecting the United Nations. If they were serious about speaking clearly and honestly, they would remove themselves from Sana'a, where they are held hostage. So, I mean, we're basically listening to an organization that is being held hostage under Houthi guns, telling us we should pull back. That's not credible on the United Nations standpoint. We also need to recognize that perhaps the United Nations framework for a future peace in Yemen isn't actually ever going to work. In the United States, you wouldn't get Kamala Harris and Donald Trump being co-presidents. So this notion that there should be a big tent in which everyone participates, that's not how democracy works. When I look at Yemen today, I see that the Southern Transitional Council controls facts on the ground, controls governance, controls military, and so they should have a much larger say than a group like ISLA, let alone other groups that don't control anything. The United States and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates should give greater credence to those who control the situation on the ground in Yemen, rather than those who sit in the United Nations, fly business class back and forth, make hundreds of thousands of dollars in salary, and ultimately do nothing other than smoke cigarettes and drink coffee.
Yeah, you might be right at this point, Dr. Rubin, okay? And many still question the role of the United Nations today in Yemen. Okay, now always in the context of the US help to Yemenis, Dr. Rubin, okay? This brings us to the point of what we call the signal gate controversy, and sharing precise information about weapon packages, targets, and timing via what we call encrypted messaging app. It was called by many as a blunder, okay? Some others even described it. They said this incident made President Donald Trump's national security team look like a pack of amateurs. The question is, Dr. Rubin, what do those messages actually reveal substantively about the US campaign?
Look, I agree with the critics. It was immature, it was unprofessional, and I would go further, it risked American lives if any of our adversaries had tapped into those signal conversations to know when the planes would be coming and where they would be going. There is absolutely no excuse for that sort of incompetence. That said, I want to step back for a moment. In Washington right now, in New York, elsewhere, people are piling in and focusing their outrage on Signalgate. But where is that outrage that the Houthis for more than a decade have been starving tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Arabs? Where is the outrage about what's going on in Sudan? Where is the outrage about the Chinese creating the greatest industrial concentration camps since World War II? The fact of the matter is, people should be fired over Signalgate. But we shouldn't ignore what's going on in Yemen. That's the big picture, and we can't take our eye off it.
Okay. Now in the same context, Dr. Rubin, as Yemenis now count on the United States, okay, to help them get rid of the Houthis, as you have suggested in one of your articles, okay? When this signal gate came into light, okay, some people just started doubting how those group of amateurs, in the terms of other experts, would help Yemenis get rid of the Houthis.
You know, on one hand, there's reason to be concerned. But on the other hand, what makes Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth different is he's actually served in combat. He's former Special Forces, and therefore he has an understanding of some of the tactics on the ground that perhaps people back at normally at the head of the Pentagon don't, where you have, I mean, when I worked in the Pentagon, I worked under Donald Rumsfeld, who was, when push came to shove, he was a politician. He didn't necessarily understand these details. And so I expect what you're going to see out of our Defense Department is action, but perhaps not the same sort of action that we normally see. That when Pete Hegseth looks at war plans, now that he's been chastised about how to keep the secret, he's going to ask certain questions and act in a creative way that perhaps his predecessors wouldn't. So my advice to the adversaries of the United States, my advice to the adversaries of Yemen, such as the Houthis, such as the Iranians, they should expect something to occur to them that they would never have expected before. The age of Biden, the age of Obama is over.
Yeah.
Frankly, the age of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush is over as well.
Yeah.
They're dealing with a new United States here, for better or for worse.
Okay. A final point, if you may, Dr. Rubin. Okay. Now, some Yemeni experts also argue that the Houthi missile threat will only be resolved by going upstream and adopting what they called fresh approaches that directly challenge Houthi control and resilience on the ground. In your opinion, Dr. Rubin, what are some of these fresh downstream approaches which can break the resolve of the Houthis?
Well, you know, I said before that I don't think American forces should be on the ground, but that doesn't mean American weaponry shouldn't. The Southern Transitional Council especially has proven itself very adept, very agile, very competent, and controls territory. If they have the ability to down Houthi drones, or as some other countries do, to actually hijack them mid-flight and turn them against the people like the Houthis who think they're controlling them, that's a net positive. I also think that it's useful, perhaps, for some in the South to understand that the United States would bless them working up the Red Sea coast. While missiles can fly from higher in the mountains, this would also prevent some of the smuggling at smaller ports, such as Mocha. And like I said, it's time to close down the port of Hodeidah and rechannel some of this weaponry, some of this humanitarian supply. I also believe that the Southern Transitional Council is able to do that with U.S. assistance materially.
Okay. This brings us to the end of this interview, Dr. Michael. Thank you so much for your time and insights, and thank you for talking to Yemen Today TV.
Thank you, and I hope your audience has had a wonderful Eid. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all for this time. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.